Over the past several months, a bunch of new Pokemon was added into Pokemon GO, including a couple of really powerful new Shadow Pokemon. When it comes to the absolute best Pokemon for each type, that list is going to look really different from how it did just a year ago. In this video, I'm going to be going over every single type in Pokemon GO and talk about what Pokemon are the very best within those types. Alright, let's get right into it. Okay, how's it going everyone? It's me, it's Jinsula. I hope you're having a good day and welcome to today's Pokemon GO video. Okay, so several months ago I made a video going over the top Pokemon for every single type. Within that video, I was going over a lot of Pokemon that was at the time the best Pokemon there was. But of course, ever since then, we've had a whole bunch of new Pokemon and Shadow Pokemon that was introduced into the game. And because of that, the list has been changed quite drastically. I really did want to make an update video to what the top Pokemon are within Pokemon GO. Of course, every single Pokemon that I'm going to be talking about is in the perspective of PvE content. Considering that there's just so much variance within the GO Battle League, it's going to look incredibly different for what Pokemon is going to be considered the best of a certain type. Alright, so without further ado, let's jump right into it. And let's start off with bug types. Now, the absolute best Mega Evolution for bug types is currently Mega Pinsir. And you will want to make sure you have the moves Bug Bite and X Scissor on your Mega Pinsers. It's going to deal an insane amount of bug type DPS, and it's also going to boost up other bug types, which typically do not deal as much DPS compared to other types. So it's very important that you boost up the DPS of every bug type in your raid. Now, when it comes to the top DPS Pokemon, when it comes to bug types, it's going to be Volcarona as well as Pheromosa. Volcarona is of course a Pokemon you could only get through egg hatching, so it's essentially available to everyone. But Pheromosa is an Ultra Beast that is in 5-star raids every so often, and if you haven't gotten yourself a good Pheromosa just yet, well, you probably will want to use other bug types until you do. Of course, a non-legendary and non-shadow option is going to be Vikavolt as well as regular Pinsir. Now, next up, let's move on to dark types, and this list is going to be very simple. In terms of the best Mega Evolution, there's going to be a lot of different options, but I would say that Mega Tyranitar is going to edge out the rest of the competition. The main reason for this is of course because Tyranitar recently got the move Brutal Swing, and that gives it an insane amount of dark type DPS as long as you're using it in raid battles. Now, in terms of the absolute best DPS Pokemon when it comes to dark types, well, that's also going to be Tyranitar, but more specifically the Shadow version. And of course, you will want to have Bite and Brutal Swing on that Pokemon. But when it comes to non-Shadow, non-Legendary, and non-Mega DPS, just go with regular Tyranitars with Bite and Brutal Swing, as well as Hydreigon with its Community Day move, Brutal Swing. Alright, next up, let's move on to Dragon types, because of course, when it comes to Dragon types, there was a major addition earlier this year, and that is of course Mega Rayquaza. This Pokemon is by and large the absolute best Dragon type currently in the game. Of course, it's also one of the most powerful Mega Evolutions in the game, so naturally, if you are able to Mega Evolve your best Rayquaza, you will want to make sure you use it anytime you need a Dragon type Pokemon. And when it comes to the absolute best DPS Pokemon when it comes to Dragon types, that's going to belong to two different Shadow Pokemon, the first of which is of course Shadow Salamence, and the second of which is going to be Shadow Garchomp. Both of these shadows deal an insane amount of DPS as Dragon types, so if you happen to have a really good one of either of them, then make sure you power it up, and you're going to deal a lot of Dragon type damage. But of course, you could use their non-shadow forms as well. Considering that they're both at the top tier when it comes to Dragon-type DPS, it's definitely still worth investing into, and it's going to be a lot easier to get. Next up, let's move on to electric types, and the Mega Evolution that's going to be the absolute best among the many that have an electric type is going to be Mega Manectric. Much like with Brutal Swing with Dark-type DPS, electric types really need to have one particular charge attack, and that is of course Wild Charge. Considering that Mega Manectric has access to that move, it's going to give it the absolute best DPS possible out of all of the electric types that are available. But when it comes to the top DPS Pokemon that are not Mega Evolutions, Shadow Raikou is still going to be king. As long as you have one with Volt Switch and Wild Charge, it is definitely going to be worth investing into. And then of course, closely behind it is going to be Xurkitree, which is another very powerful electric type Pokemon, and in fact, it doesn't even have Wild Charge, and imagine how powerful it will be if it ever gets that move. Now, when it comes to non-legendary and non-shadow Pokemon that you could use as electric types, Electivire and Magnezone are going to be top picks. Both of those Pokemon have access to Wild Charge, so they're going to deal a lot of DPS just naturally. Next up, let's move on to fairy types, and this is a very interesting type because there's not a lot of optimal fairy types that are currently available in the game, but there is one that is going to be an absolute must, and that is of course Mega Gardevoir. If you have yourself a Mega Gardevoir with both Charm and Dazzling Gleam, it's going to deal an insane amount of fairy type DPS. Now, in terms of the top DPS Pokemon for fairy types, it's of course going to be Shadow Gardevoir as well as Xerneas. Now, when it comes to non-Mega, non-Shadow, and non-Legendary fairy types, you have 3 really good options, and they are Togekiss, regular Gardevoir, as well as Primarina. Any of these 3 Pokemon with fairy type attacks is going to be serviceable, and you will definitely want to make sure you have them in your raid group if you do not have any of the top counters. Alright, next, let's move on to a type that is actually countered by fairy types, and that is of course fighting. This has been unchanged ever since it was released, but the top Mega Evolution is still going to be Mega Blaziken. This Pokemon is incredible, and it has a lot of versatility as well. If you need a Mega Evolution with a fighting type, Mega Blaziken is your one-stop shop. Now, when it comes to the top DPS Pokemon, when it comes to fighting types, nothing will beat Terrakion with Double Kick and Sacred Sword, even a couple of the Shadow Pokemon that are currently available. And of course, there's also Keldeo with Low Kick and Sacred Sword. Both of those Pokemon, if you are able to max them out with these moves, are going to be the absolute best fighting type Pokemon that are not Mega Evolutions in your arsenal. Now, speaking of non-Mega, non-Shadow, and non-Legendary Pokemon, of course, the top 3 are going to be relatively the same as before. It's going to be Lucario, Conkeldurr, and Machamp. All 3 of these Pokemon are incredibly powerful as fighting types. Alright, now let's move on to fire types, and yeah, the Mega Evolution is also going to be Mega Blaziken. Like I said earlier, this one Mega Evolution is incredibly versatile. You could use it as your top fighting type raid attacker, or you could also use it as your top fire type raid attacker as well. But when it comes to the top DPS Pokemon, yes, there are plenty of options like Moltres and Entei, but none of them are going to compare to Reshiram with Fusion Flare. That Pokemon is absolutely going to be the best fire type currently in the game, and it's going to be that by a country mile. But when it comes to non-legendary, non-mega, and non-shadows, you have the options of Volcarona, Darmanitan, as well as Chandelure. Now let's move on to flying types, and we're going back to a Mega Evolution that we mentioned earlier. The best flying type Mega Evolution is going to be Mega Rayquaza. Now, of course, you will want to make sure you have flying type attacks on Mega Rayquaza, but considering that you need Dragon Ascent on it in order to Mega Evolve it anyway, well, it's naturally going to have that fighting type charge attack. But when it comes to the top DPS Pokemon that are not Mega Evolutions, well, regular Rayquaza with Dragon Ascent is also going to be extremely powerful alongside Shadow Moltres, which was of course the top flying type earlier. Now, when it comes to non-Shadow, non-Legendary, and non-Mega Evolutions, there's 3 options that you could go with, and all 3 of them are actually extremely easy to get. Honchkrow, Staraptor, and Braviary will be the top flying type Pokemon in the game that are not Legendaries or Shadow Pokemon. Next up, let's move on to Ghost types, and of course this is going to be pretty straightforward and somewhat unchanged from before. Mega Gengar is going to be your absolute best Ghost type Mega Evolution currently in the game. Now, the one caveat is of course that Mega Gengar is going to be weak against Psychic type attacks, and typically when you use Ghost types is going to be against Psychic type raid bosses. So obviously there's a lot of arguments that could be made that Mega Banette is going to be a much better Mega Evolution, but when it comes to pure raw DPS, Mega Gengar is going to be the way to go. And then going along with that theme, when it comes to the top DPS Pokemon among all the Ghost types, Shadow Gengar, which is of course a brand new addition to Pokemon GO in the most recent Team Go Rocket takeover, is going to be the absolute best DPS non-Mega Ghost type Pokemon. And alongside it is going to be an old favorite, and that is of course going to be Giratina Origin Form. But when it comes to non-Shadow, non-Mega, and non-Legendary Pokemon, you have 3 really good options. They're going to be Chandelure, Gengar, Gengar, and Banette. Alright, now let's move on to grass types, and this list is going to be pretty simple, simply because there's not too many grass types that are available to you that are going to be viable for raids. In terms of the Mega Evolution, you really have only two good options, and they are of course Mega Sceptile and Mega Venusaur. However, Mega Sceptile is going to outperform Mega Venusaur by quite a bit, so make sure you're going with that Mega Evolution. It's definitely going to be really powerful against a variety of different bosses. On top of that, Mega Sceptile also has the dual dragon typing, which is going to give it a lot of resistances that other grass types typically do not have. Now, when it comes to the top DPS grass type Pokemon in Pokemon Go, bar none, it's going to be Kartana. This Pokemon, ever since it was introduced, has been a nightmare for any water types as well as ground types. It's an extremely powerful Pokemon, but it is also incredibly squishy. So you will want to be careful when using Kartana. There is a chance it'll get knocked out by one charge attack anyway, but it does deal a lot of DPS, so at least you'll get a lot of damage in before it actually does get knocked out. Now the other Pokemon that's a top DPS Pokemon is of course going to be Shadow Tangrowth, but considering that it's been so long since we had access to Shadow Tangela, I would say it's not realistic to go after this particular Pokemon. But of course, aside from these Pokemon, there's of course Roserade as well as Chestnut. They're going to be the top non-Mega, non-Shadow, and non-Legendary Grass-type Pokemon currently in the game. Next up, let's move on to ground types, and this is going to be really simple. The absolute best Mega Evolution, well technically this is a Primal Reversion, is going to be Primal Groudon. That Pokemon is the absolute king of ground types, and it's not going to have competition for a long time. Even with the upcoming release of Mega Garchomp, it's still going to outperform just about any ground type that will ever be released in the game. So if you want yourself a really powerful ground type Mega Evolution, then I would definitely prioritize getting Primal Groudon. Now in terms of the top DPS Pokemon when it comes to ground types, this is actually going to be a brand new addition from the most recent Team Go Rocket Takeover, and it's going to be Shadow Exeggutor. Without question, it's going to be the absolute best DPS Pokemon that's not a legendary or a mega. So make sure you're going out and trying to get this particular Shadow while you still can. Now when it comes to ground types, there's going to be 3 non-legendary, non-mega, and non-shadow Pokemon that will always outperform the rest. And that is going to be regular Garchomp, regular Exeggutor, as well as Mamoswine with high horsepower. Alright, next up, let's move on to ice types. And yeah, this is going to be a pretty straightforward list. Nothing much has really changed since the last time we talked about ice types. And that is of course going to be Mega Glalie as the absolute best Mega Evolution with ice types. And then when it comes to the top DPS Pokemon, it's of course going to be Shadow Weavile along with Shadow Mamoswine. Both of these Pokemon, specifically Shadow Mamoswine, have been at the top when it came to Ice-type DPS for the longest time, and I do think they're going to remain there for a while. But when it comes to non-Shadow, non-Mega, or non-Legendary Ice types, there's actually a brand new addition that was recently introduced, and that is going to be Baxcalibur. A lot of people think of this Pokemon as kind of like the miniature version of Kyurem, but the big difference is that Baxcalibur has a much more favorable Ice-type moveset. Joining it are of course regular Mamoswine as well as Galarian Darmanitan. Both of these Pokemon are also really solid Ice-type raid attackers. Alright, next up, let's talk about normal types. And this is going to be interesting because when it comes to normal types, no one's really looking for normal type raid damage. So yeah, you could pretty much kind of ignore this, but if you're just curious what the top normal types are, it's going to be Mega Lopunny when it comes to normal type raid damage, and then of course when it comes to the top DPS damage, it's going to be Regigigas or Shadow Regigigas. Alright, now let's talk about poison types, and this is going to be a very interesting list because some of the top Pokemon don't even have a poison type fast attack. The top Mega Evolution is kind of questionable, but I would say it is going to be Mega Gengar. And that is of course because it is also a poison type on top of being a ghost type, and it has access to one of the most powerful charge attacks in the game when it comes to poison type damage, and that is of course Sludge Bomb. The only problem is that it does not have access to one of the most powerful fast attacks when it comes to poison type damage, and that is of course Poison Jab. But you can still make work with Hex to get a lot of energy and use Sludge Bomb, and you should be okay. When it comes to the top DPS Pokemon, when it comes to poison type damage, that's going to belong to Nihilego as well as Shadow Gengar with Sludge Bomb. And when it comes to the best non-Shadow, non-Mega, and non-Legendary poison type Pokemon, those are going to be Roserade as well as Overqwil. Alright, next up, let's talk about psychic types. And this is of course one of the most popular types in the game, but unfortunately, it's completely dominated by one particular Pokemon. When it comes to the Mega Evolution, it's of course going to be Mega Alakazam. On top of it being the absolute best psychic type in the game, it's also going to be one of the best generalists. And yeah, you do not want to ignore that fact. Now, when it comes to the top DPS psychic types, well, that crown has belonged to Shadow Mewtwo and regular Mewtwo for the longest time, and it has still remained so. This is probably going to be unchanged for years to come, and I think the only Pokemon that's going to be able to dethrone either of these Pokemon is of course going to be Mega Mewtwo. So even in that regard, I think Mewtwo is forever going to be the absolute best psychic type. But when it comes to non-Mega, non-Shadow, and non-Legendary psychic type Pokemon, the best are going to be Metagross, regular Alakazam, as well as Espeon. Alright, now let's talk about the absolute best rock types. When it comes to the Mega Evolution that you will want to use, it's going to be Mega Tyranitar with Smackdown and Stone Edge. Now when it comes to the top DPS Pokemon with rock types, those are going to be Shadow Rhyperior as well as Shadow Rampardos, which is of course a brand new addition. And of course non-Mega, non-Shadow, and non-Legendary rock types, the best are going to be unchanged from the past couple of years. It's going to be Rampardos and Rhyperior, but a new addition is going to be Tyrantrum. The reason for that is because this Pokemon has gained access to the move Meteor Beam, which is going to increase its rankings when it comes to rock type DPS. Next up, let's talk about steel types. And yeah, this is going to be relatively unchanged from previous lists. The absolute best Mega Evolution when it comes to steel types is still going to be Mega Scizor. And when it comes to the top DPS Pokemon, that is still going to be Shadow Metagross. But when it comes to non-Shadow, non-Mega, and non-Legendary Steel types, there's actually plenty that are going to be better than even Legendaries. The absolute best is of course going to be Metagross, along with Excadrill, as well as B-Sharp. Alright, and finally, let's talk about water types. And this is going to be the last type that we're going to be talking about. The absolute best Mega Evolution that you could use is actually the other Primal Reversion, and that is of course Primal Kyogre. By and large, this is going to be an absolute must if you need water type raid damage, because Primal Kyogre is a super powerful Pokemon, and it's going to be unrivaled by pretty much every other Pokemon in the game, including Mega Evolutions. But when it comes to the absolute best DPS, that's of course going to belong to Shadow Swampert, as well as regular Kyogre. And then of course when it comes to the top water type DPS Pokemon, when it comes to non-Mega, non-Shadow, and non-Legendaries, this is actually going to be switched up from before. At the very top of this list, it's now going to be Greninja with Water Shuriken and Hydro Cannon. This is of course because recently we had Froakie Community Day, and through it, Greninja got access to both of these new moves. And because of that, it shot up a whole lot in the rankings when it comes to water type DPS, so it's definitely going to be a must-have if you want to deal water type raid damage. But rounding out the list is going to be the familiar faces. Regular Swampert with Hydro Cannon, as well as Kingler with Crabhammer are still going to be among the absolute best non-Mega, non-Shadow, and non-Legendary water type DPS Pokemon. Alright, and there you have it. These are the absolute best Pokemon of every single type that you can currently get, or probably will not be able to get anytime soon. Every single one of these Pokemon are worth investing into, and I highly suggest you do if you want to get ahead in Pokemon Go. Alright, and with that said, that's going to be it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and found it to be informative. If you did, make sure you hit that thumbs up button and subscribe if it's your first time here. And don't forget that little bell so you can stay up to date on whenever I upload videos. And I want to give a quick shout out to all of my patrons on Patreon. You make this channel content possible. If you want to support my channel in any way, big or small, then make sure you go and check out the links in the description below. For all my patrons of my Patreon family, they get a permanent spot on my in-game friends list. So if you want to interact with me in some way within Pokemon Go, like with remote raids or the friendship system, then make sure you go and check out my Patreon. Also, if you want to support my channel in a big way that doesn't require you to spend any money, then you can do so by following me on social media. My handle is @Jinsula, and I'm on the following platforms. Alright, and with that said, that's going to be it. I'm Jinsula, be safe, have fun, love yourself, and I'll catch you all later.